Hello, welcome to Conversations with Kate. Today I am thrilled to be joined by Ross Murray of GLAAD. It is arguably one of the most recognized LGBT organizations in the world. So before we get into the conversation, I have to say, Ross, thank you very much for being on the program today.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me.
And I'm just going to quickly read to the audience just a bio from the GLAAD website, and I will link that in the description under the video below. So Ross Murray is the Director of News and Faith Initiatives at GLAAD, where he amplifies the voices of LGBT affirming communities of faith and LGBT people of faith. He speaks and writes frequently about the relationship between religion and LGBT people. He has written and appeared on numerous media outlets such as CNN, MSNBC, the Washington Post, Huffington Post, and Religion News Service. Wow. So Ross holds a BA and an MA in religion, as well as an MBA. Ross is also founder and director of the Naming Project, a faith-based camp for LGBT youth and their allies, which has appeared in the award-winning film Camp Out, as well as the controversial episode Pray the Gay Away of Our America with Lisa Ling. He is based in New York. Fantastic. Again, Ross, I can't thank you enough for listening to me, for agreeing to be on the program.
Certainly, thank you. And I'll say there's a little update from that bio. I'm still doing a lot of faith work for GLAAD, but now I'm in charge of what's called the GLAAD Media Institute, which is training and education and research and consultation for media folks, for advocacy type figures, for corporations. So that's been taking a lot of my time at GLAAD now.
So yeah, I mean, these bios are usually just a snapshot, just a little snippet of what people do. So we're going to find out a little bit more about your background and your work in the ministry, because I didn't mention that Ross is also a Lutheran minister. And I think one of the things I'm seeking to do with this conversation, Ross, is really support and encourage not just my LGBT audience members, but everyone to really understand that the faith community, the spiritual community, the community that engages in the work of consciousness is made up of all different types of people, and that everyone should feel that they can just enjoy this part of their lives. I think some people have been burned and sort of told that they're not allowed to do certain things, but you know, through this conversation, we're going to learn a lot about just who we are in this community together. So I'm excited to talk to you. So just to give you a bit of background about me when I was young, those of you people who've read my book know that I was introduced to metaphysical ideas. I mean, even though I grew up in a traditional religious family, I was introduced to the ideas of philosophers like Neville Goddard and Florence Scovel Shinn and Napoleon Hill, and very much involved in thought causation and all of that. But the faith aspect of what I do is huge. It is really the cornerstone of what I do. And I feel very much that introduction as a child has shaped what I do today. It'd be really interesting for us to hear, as I said, you're a Lutheran minister. How has your background led you to your work in the ministry?
Oh yeah, certainly. So I grew up, and I still am very Lutheran, and I grew up in a very small town on the Canadian border in northern Minnesota. And so I was part of my church. I was very active and realized that I really liked the participation with the church. I liked the involvement. And because when you're in a small town, there aren't that many people to do things. So the same people do a lot. So I was a youth. I was playing music and leading worship and piano. Occasionally, when the pastor was gone, I'd be asked if I would preach. I got told I'd make good clergy at some point. And I realized that I really enjoyed, especially aspects of practical ministry and youth ministry specifically. So I went from my small town into university and studied youth and family ministry, which is a really interesting combination of philosophy, theology, but it's also very practical. It's always sort of like, what is the impact going to be? How do we do this? Which I always find really interesting. I have a hard time when everything's only cognitive. I want it to always have a real world sort of impact to it. So that was what my undergraduate degree was in. It's when I went to seminary, what I ended up studying. my getting into LGBTQ advocacy came a little bit on the tail end of a lot of that. I think I thought that I was going to have a more traditional church-based job. But the denomination I was in did not allow clergy or deacons who were LGBTQ and in same-sex relationships. And there were several that had been dismissed or removed. Some were living in secrecy and hiding a big part of their lives and their identity and their relationships. And I sort of stepped into this at a time that I sort of thought, well, I can fly under the radar. And I joined a traveling music ministry team that was probably a bit more conservative than the spaces that I came from, and was going to be very open and honest about being gay, about having a partner, and it did not go as well as it had up until that point. I got the university very well, but this ministry team, after several months of back and forth and turmoil, and I was still traveling and visiting these churches and doing programs, I was eventually told that I was too much of a divisive presence on the team and removed. And I realized I have just about every privilege possible. I have a supportive family. I've got a supportive community, and I couldn't make it work in here, which means this is not a system that's going to work, right? So I sort of got drafted into a movement that was trying to make my church and my denomination more welcoming and more inclusive, and ended up getting involved with them first on the local level, and then eventually on the national level, where 11 years ago now, in 2009, we changed the policy of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America to recognize same-gender marriage, to allow clergy that were in long-term committed relationships. And once we changed that policy, then I felt like it was an okay place for me to really truthfully live out a calling as a deacon. So that's what I am now. I'm a Lutheran deacon doing LGBTQ advocacy where the church meets the world.
That is absolutely incredible. And I love the parallels between Martin Luther, who is for many a divisive character, but also a reformer and somebody who was very interested in progress. And I think it's important that you make these sorts of remarks that people start to think, okay, I might be in a space that is hostile to me, but I can actually think about how it can be better. I can think about how it can change, because they are not the ones who need to change. They are who they are. It's sometimes policy, it's sometimes attitude, but we should be kind of thinking in a progress direction. So I love what you said. So let's just we're going to go on to your work in GLAAD in just a moment, but just I'm somebody who I just hate the idea that people be denied the opportunity or the right to really express all aspects of their life. So I, in my own experience, I know that traditional religious groups and spaces can be openly hostile to LGBT people. How do you encourage someone to stay the course, to not allow bigoted attitudes or ignorance to shut down, their desire to engage in their spiritual life?
Right. When I had my experience of getting kicked out of that ministry organization, I think that was a moment that I really had to examine what had happened and where the problem lie. And I had to ask myself, is my problem with God? And as a Christian and as a Lutheran, I think that God created me and created all of me, and that my sexual orientation and my gender identity are both a part of who I am, just like they are for everybody. And so I couldn't really, there was no fault there with God. What I found my issue was with a human institution. And I think it's always been important when talking about churches and faith institutions, they are human institutions, right? We talk about the goodness and the perfection of God, but the reality is we are never that, right? We always fall short of that. And we try to do the best we can to follow the calling of God. And yet that doesn't get achieved. We want to do good things. It doesn't always happen. And I think that the church is a good, helpful institution and a tool, but the church is not God. The church is not perfect. It's created by humans. The policy was created by humans. And that means that maybe it was what people thought was best at a given time. But as it got examined, or as these examples would show up, we realized that was actually harming people. It was not letting people live their full authentic selves. And I think there's a parallel. The churches have these policies, and it depends on whether we are really stuck on whether I am worshiping the institution or worshiping the God that has created the entire world, that I believe created the entire world. Parallel systems show up in terms of systems of justice, in terms of policies that don't let people live and be their full authentic self without fear, without retribution, without some form of punishment. And I realize I'm saying this right now. Well, in the United States, we've had a series of attacks on and killings of African-American people, often by systems, right, by law enforcement. And so I see those same sins showing up and manifesting themselves in all of these different institutions, which are human institutions. And if we want to work to change to make them better, even while we know that as we work to change to make them better, that we're still not God. We're still never going to get to that place of perfection, and that ultimately it is God that we end up relying on.
Yeah, I love that. I love the way you put that. I think the thought that came to me while you were speaking, Ross, is that if we see God as divine or a supreme being superior to us as humanity, then we can really feel confident about deferring to God rather than to deferring to these systems that we've constructed to sort of organize ourselves. So I want to turn now to your work at GLAAD. As I said, it's one of the most instantly recognizable organizations in the world. I think most people know about the glamour of the GLAAD Awards and things like that, and all the celebrity involvement. But I'm really interested in the faith work. Was it always a part of GLAAD's mission to have this space for LGBT people, or did it come as a result of the kinds of things that that the community was saying, oh, look, we need this, this is missing? So was that?
It's always been a little incorporated. I know it predated my time at GLAAD. And when I was hired, I've had many different jobs and titles at GLAAD. So when I was first hired, I was the director of religion, faith, and values. And so I was doing all religion all the time. And I was the second person to have that job. And I know that position was created in 2004. One of the things that happened in 2004 was the United States re-election of George W. Bush. And exit polls often said that most voters said that moral values was what they were voting on. This was also the same year that many of the anti-LGBTQ marriage amendments were coming up state by state, and was even proposed federally. And that became a wedge issue that probably really pitted communities against each other, and made the false claim that to be religious, to be faithful, meant that you had to oppose LGBTQ people. And so, moral values is a ambiguous phrase that we don't really know what it means, and everyone who used it probably meant something different. But GLAAD realized that there are people that have moral values that do include LGBTQ people. There are moral values that want people to, again, live full, abundant lives. And so how do we tell those stories? How do we lift up pro-LGBTQ voices of faith? How do we make sure that there are leaders that are speaking in the media that can address Christians and Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Mormons and on, these groups that can make a case from within each one of these traditions for why LGBTQ inclusion and acceptance exists. So when I started, my favorite thing that I would do was to work with leaders that were in what we kind of historically or stereotypically known as anti-LGBTQ, find people that were pro-LGBTQ, and then elevate their voice. So can I get gay Mormons to speak out? Can I get transgender Muslims to speak out? Can I get Catholics to speak out? And to just create that cognitive dissonance to always say, just because you hear it from the leadership doesn't mean that is what is true for all believers. And I always think that's really important to say it that way.
Absolutely. And you're so right about elevating the right kind of voices. Sometimes we're drowned out with this just one perspective and one way of thinking and doing things. But I love the way that you really are very Lutheran in that.
I'm so very Lutheran. It's.
I think that's fantastic. So earlier when you were speaking, you used the word authentic or authenticity. And I think that that's something that's so important, particularly for young people, because we're in a world of so much uncertainty. And not that everyone doesn't feel this, but I think the youth are really bombarded with these ideas about who they are supposed to be. And so I'm interested now in your work with youth through the naming project and Camp Out and things like that. So could you just talk a bit about that? I just want to excite my audience who are listening to you, and especially younger people listening.
Sure. I mean, one of the reasons why we do the naming project, one is because I love youth ministry, and I want to make sure that there's affirming youth ministry. And especially when we started it in 2004, there was an assumption that there was a place that was good and quality and affirming and doing youth ministry. It was kind of, depending on what church you were in and what youth minister and what pastor you had. And so we created it first as just a meeting point for people living in the Minneapolis, Minnesota area. And we quickly added a component of a summer camp. For Lutherans, summer camps are really a big part of our faith formation. It is, many of us went to Lutheran Bible camps as kids, me included, and a lot of us grew up there, became camp counselors, worked in these summer camp programs. And there was a statistic that's been thrown around that I think I can find the stat that says 75% of Lutheran ministers, clergy, said that they had a formative experience at a Bible camp. And so this is part of kind of what seals and creates your identity. And so I thought, well, this was so true, and it was true for me. What if your faith identity and you being seen as a created child of God with a sexual orientation and a gender identity were the same thing, as opposed to being two different parts of formation? And so the summer camp really has been that. And we've had youth fly in from all over the country. We've not had anyone internationally yet, but I'm working on it, who've been there as a part of the week. And the program really, it looks like a Lutheran summer camp. The week, the daily structure, the way that we do our Bible study, the way we do campfire and evening worship, like all of those things really could be plucked out of the camp that I went to or the camp that other people went to. But I think what makes it unique and special is the fact of the people that we have it. Changes the tone, makes it much more sparkly. Arts and crafts are very popular. We add things like a drag show or a cabaret, things that make it very queer, but also keep it really, really faithful and really grounded. And I think my favorite part has been the Bible study, because we used our scripture as a springboard into understanding the parallels between these stories that happened to people, hundreds of thousands of years ago and our lives today. And young LGBTQ people see those parallels, which I find really amazing.
Absolutely fantastic. So as you're talking, I could just imagine the scene. Okay, you're in a space that is loving, you can thrive in that environment. And this is what I'm interested to know, how do kids keep that alive when they're no longer in camp? I'd be really interested to hear, you've had the greatest time at camp, and then you have to go home or to your community or to, school or whatever it might be. And it's like, oh my God, back to this. But how do they keep that? Yeah, exactly. How do they keep that energy?
It's hard. And our camp, we even talk about it this way. Our camp that we use is on an island in a lake. And so it is physically separated from the rest of the world. And we sort of talk about like on the island and off the island. And we spend the last day, maybe the last full 24 hours, kind of preparing them for what going back out into the rest of the world is, and how they can keep this identity, keep this self-understanding, keep this awareness alive while they're out doing their kind of normal everyday lives. And in some ways, it might be just remembering that there's a community that cares about them, a community that can point to the way that God cares about them. In some ways, it might be that they were able to think and process things out loud in a safe space that they couldn't process out loud in other spaces, and they come out with a greater understanding. Partially now because of social media, people are able to stay in touch much better than they ever were before. And so we've been able to use social media both through the naming project and the connections they make with each other, just so they can keep in touch, so they can visit each other, and keep those stories alive. And we try to do that throughout the year. We've been doing this summer since we sadly had to cancel our summer camp programs because of the coronavirus, we shifted into doing a monthly evening virtual campfire. And we've been singing some of the songs that we sing. We've had some great reflections by some of our counselors and our leaders. This last time, which was just on Sunday, one of our leaders did a piece of art that he was planning to do for camp this summer, which was called drop painting. That was mostly putting layers of paint in a cup and dropping it on a canvas and making it sound swirl, and it looked really cool. Another leader of ours who usually teaches the campers a dance routine that they rehearse through the week has put up videos teaching people a very short dance routine, and then has been putting together a video of our camper and our counselor alumni doing this dance and then making a little video out of it. So it's been ways that we can keep people active throughout the year, knowing that really our strongest time is when we're all together in the same space at the same time.
That sounds awesome. I was just thinking, it's virtual, so it's like online. Is that something that international LGBTs can tap into?
Yes,
like,
the two camps that we've done so far are on the Naming Project's Facebook page. If you go into the videos section, we did one on Easter, and then we did one Memorial Day weekend. So we seem to choose holiday weekends, and we'll have our next one in July. So they're usually they'll be late for UK people, but it's 9:30 p.m. Eastern time. So maybe you want to watch it the next morning. That seems too early for you all. But yeah, that's available. People can watch and participate and really, enjoy themselves and hear the conversation and hear the patter, and even be a part of that kind of chat conversation that happens while people are watching and participating.
That's so cool. So I'm going to put a link to the Facebook, the Naming Project, under this video, because I mean, as I say, GLAAD is recognizable, but I think a lot of people who are not actively involved in LGBT with the community are thinking just about the razzmatazz of the the GLAAD awards and things like that. So we
are a lot beyond the media awards. Those are helpful, good. I'm happy we have them. Although I have my work is completely something else that I use them. I think the media awards are fascinating because I now realize how much we use them as a tool for the rest of our work. Is that, we can say things like people should pay attention to HIV, and maybe people listen, maybe they don't. We can somehow get Beyonce to say people should care about HIV. People pay attention, right? And she has a following, she has a voice, she has people that are going to do what she says to do just because it's her. And I think that's helpful. And so, and I found that celebrities want to be helpful, and they often look to us to help them figure out what the most effective thing that they can do is. And I think that's a really good relationship we have. And we use our media award stage as a way with which to do that.
Fantastic. So we know all about the like I said, the celebrity work, but I'm going to link the Naming Project stuff in this video. But it's a testament to you, Ross, that I'm awake. I have been without sleep for 2 days. My husband wasn't very well.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's fine. He's home now. He's okay. But I'm feeding off your energy. This is fantastic. Okay, I'm going to switch to myself now. Sure. So I studied the teachings of the philosopher Neville Goddard, and I think the thing he's perhaps most well known for is this idea of thought causation, that the human imagination is God, or for some people operates as God, in that it's this infinite creative resource. Now, some people struggle with the idea that we can have that kind of autonomy when it comes to our lived experience. And it's kind of, oh, well, then you're trying to absolve certain people of guilt if they've done wrong. For example, this man that was killed so tragically with the police officer, the George Floyd, I think.
George Floyd, yeah.
Yeah, and it's so sad. And the sort of thing that people say to me is, oh, are you saying that he made that happen because he was thinking the wrong way, or he wasn't thinking positively? There's this kind of conflict for a lot of people. I just want to know what your thoughts are when it comes to this idea of our creative aspect, our creative part of ourselves having this role in sort of help crafting our day-to-day lived experience.
Yeah, I think the day-to-day lived experiences, I see it a little bit like, I'm saying this out loud to you the first time, so let's see if this makes sense. I think of it a little bit like a kaleidoscope where certain things fall into place at certain times. And I think I'm like you. Like I don't think George Floyd, thought this into being, didn't intend or want this to happen, and is a victim. I think that we're also where we've got something between. We have him. We have a set of police officers that are carrying a history, perhaps some prejudices, perhaps whatever else they have going on with them. They have someone who alerted the police and the authorities that probably are also carrying their own prejudices. And none of these things happen in a vacuum in that moment. They're all informed by years of systematic oppression and things that shape and home both our mindset and our human institutions like our justice system. And those things come together and collide in really horrible, tragic ways. And I realize even though I'm saying this, it sounds like I'm trying to diminish and downplay what happened. It is so horrible what has happened. And I know that George Floyd's not the first person in the United States to have this happen, and probably sadly will not be the last. And every time it happens, it's always work for those of us that weren't immediately involved in the situation, not just to make it a thought exercise, but to understand like the real disgusting human tragedy of it all, that someone had to lose their life because someone else was scared, that was informed by what they have learned or been taught or through their lived experience, what they've heard from others. And I think that you can kind of dissect it, but I'm always scared of dissecting it because then I feel like I make it less real or less horrible, and that's really hard.
But I mean, what you're saying is something that I can completely relate to, and so many people can relate to. It's a conflict, and like you say, this is an individual experience. We all are experiencing this differently. So I just wanted to get your take on it. It's really interesting.
I sort of, one of my tactics I use at GLAAD is sort of, there's the immediate situation, and that's what people kind of know about and what captures news headlines and what happens in a moment. And then what I like to do is usually like zoom out from that to say, this instance that you see and know when you're hearing about in the news, it is reflective of a longer, bigger pattern of bigger themes of things that are going on. And because the real thing is what people feel, right? They can like get a much better sense of what happened in an incident, where it's harder to sort of like to talk about 400 years of oppressive history, 400 plus years of oppressive history. And people can't fathom that. They can get this, but if they can grasp this, then perhaps you can extrapolate out to say, this didn't happen by itself, right? This is informed by laws and policies and systems in place that have been built on the sins of racism or the sins of white supremacy. And those have manifested themselves in a lot of different ways over the years. And just because, we're not using one of those old systems, like a system of slavery, doesn't mean that the racism isn't still there. It's just, it's still making itself happen in a different way.
That's so interesting, and I like that. That's something I do encourage people to do whenever they find that there's some event that's having this that's got their mind in a grasp, as it were, to just experience it macroscopically, and that helps to really dissipate some of the intensity. So Ross, you are an expert in the media. You're well used to the media. You know how it works, and it's so easy to become frightened. So I guess like for Black people hearing these stories, those stories are frightening. Similarly for the community, for LGBT people, when you hear about murders and you hear about discrimination and you hear about all of these kinds of things that happen, how can people safeguard themselves, and not just youth, but everyone? How can people, and this will be useful for everybody listening actually, how do we safeguard ourselves against these narratives that we're bombarded with and these things that cause us to become distressed?
I'm a fairly cynical person, and I feel like that cynicism has helped to protect me a little bit. one of the things that I talk about with the media is, remember that the media largely is corporate based and wants to keep people connected, wants to keep people watching. And one of the ways that you do that is by playing to emotions, right? If I can make you scared or angry or outraged, then you stay connected, right? And that gets you to my commercial at selling toothpaste. And even when they're not corporate run, they're still motivated by viewers, right? And so I let people kind of know that, like, you have to be really critical consumers of news, and to recognize that no matter what, information is going to make you feel something. And what you have to figure out to do is what to do with that thing you're feeling. Is it, do I feel despondent and don't do anything? Which sometimes we have to do that for self-care, but also it doesn't fix the problem, right? It's just me feeling bad on my couch. Does it spur me into action to say, I want to step up and do something. I want to fix this in some way. And so that's something else that it can do. I'm careful about what sources I get my news information from. And social media has made that hard because we often just see headlines and don't often see what's behind it. And I'll even say, even places that I would say are good don't always do it right. And it's easy to be salacious. It's easy to hype up conflict over nuance. And it's just helpful for us to kind of know enough to know what's going on in the world and enough to inform us on what our actions should be around a given topic or on a given day. I think if we can be motivated to do something, that's helpful. If it's just making us feel helpless and this whole world is happening all around us and we're just standing by while it's happening to us, I think that is much less helpful. And that's kind of how I try to think about it. But you know what, quite frankly, there are some days, and this week has been one of them, there's just been so much news that it's hard to figure out. Like, it makes me ask myself, am I doing anything helpful? Is anything good happening out there? Am I part of the problem? And I think those days come, and I have to kind of move through that and say, no, I am going to choose to do something worthwhile in the world. I'm motivated by this, and here's what I'm going to work on.
That's really excellent advice. And I would say, yeah, as you say, be a critical consumer of the news, and also don't be hard on yourself. We're human beings, and we are emotional beings, whether we like it or not. So just before we move on to the movable middle, which is a concept that I found really, really interesting. One of the things, as I understand it, that GLAAD is doing is helping to shape narratives, sort of getting out ahead of what's being told by amplifying the right voices. I don't know if right voices, is that correct, the right voices, but amplifying, the most valuable, the most important voices on certain issues. I'm really interested, is the narrative as relates to faith and the community a part of that, and how does that work?
Yeah, it is. I mean, what we talk about at GLAAD is wanting fair, accurate, and inclusive coverage. And I think those three adjectives are important. So it's not the right voices, or like just the good LGBTQ people. But also, we have some problematic people. We're sometimes villains. And getting ahead of it's important. We've spent so much time reacting to something bad, and this is bad, or this is defamatory. We tell, script writers or TV producers or journalists, if you work with us ahead of time, we can help you talk to the people that know the most about this. We can help connect you with someone who's an expert. We can help you tell this story in a way that really is fair and inclusive and accurate. And so that's often what our call is for media, not just, avoid getting shamed by us when you do it wrong, but let us help you do the best possible job that there is. And sometimes that's telling them, the thing that you're trying to say, the thing that you're trying to talk about is old and tired and been overdone so much. So why don't you tell this story instead? And redirect them onto something else. Because sometimes if they're not in a part of the community, I think sometimes they think they know what's the innovative stuff. But as folks that consume all of this, we tend to say, like, okay, I've seen this coming out story a lot. For trans people, I've seen the transition story a lot. That's not the only thing that exists, right? Like, what else can we put out there? And we'll complain among ourselves the media never covers this. That's a complaint when I'm talking to my friends and my colleagues. If I'm talking to a journalist, I say the same thing with a different tone. The media has never covered this. That means you can be the first. You can be the one that gets the scoop, right? There's an incentive to it. And so the things that I would complain about not appearing, we offer to say, you can do this. You don't have to just listen to us complain, and we can help you do this to the best of your ability. And faith voices are absolutely a part of that. I like seeing LGBTQ voices of faith, if they're fictional on TV or film. I love making sure that they're the ones that are being checked in with when talking or responding to whatever's happening in the news of the day. And through the Institute, I train a lot of folks. And so when a reporter comes and says, can you find me someone who is clergy that cares about this law or something? I have a list of people that I trust, that I work with, and I say, she would be the right person. You should talk to her, right? And then making that connection and helping to amplify and spotlight them. And they can say it from their own theology and their own perspective.
That is absolutely fantastic. So I mentioned the movable middle, and I'm going to put a link to that video. Can you still hear me?
Yep, you're back.
Okay. I just lost power on my... Okay, sorry, I'm going to have to shout. I've lost power with my my Bluetooth device, so hopefully you can still hear me clearly. Yeah. I was talking about the movable middle, and even though that was a teaching device, a media teaching device, as I like the idea of how to relate to those who are in support of what you do and those who are your detractors. And I was thinking about that in terms of faith and people who are having a lot of resistance to them being able to practice their faith. How can they relate to people who are perhaps not in support of what they're trying to do?
Mm-hmm. I think so. I learned this first when I was working on trying to make our church more inclusive and change their policies, is that we realized, there is a camp of detractors. And it's not that those people cannot ever be brought over to acceptance, but the form of intervention that we do with them is going to be different. The way that we're going to appeal to them, what their values are going to be really different. And the people that are in our base, our supportive base, are going to do what we ask them to do just because we ask them to do it, right? They're already there. They're going to be very easy to activate and to do something. But there's a really large section of people that are listening to me, and they're listening to someone on the other side, and they don't quite know who to believe. They don't know what to think, and they probably feel ignorant or underinformed. They are probably, this is not their priority. It's not the thing that they're spending their time or energy thinking about the way that I spend time and energy thinking about this. And so what we always think is, how do we reach them? And how do we talk to them in a way that resonates with their values and makes them understand that supporting LGBTQ people in the church or in the world is not a change of their faith or their values. It's actually a way that they live out their faith and their values. And that's what it looked like when I worked in the religion specific space. In the media, it's the same kind of thing. It's people that are listening to pundits on TV and hearing us debate. And I want them to come out on the side of pro-inclusion, which means I have to make the case to them. I don't need to win over the opponent. I need to make the case to this movable middle audience.
That's absolutely fantastic. I think, anything that can go wrong does go wrong in the world of media. But I've absolutely enjoyed this conversation, and I've learned so much from you. I think one of the ways that would really round it out nicely is how do people show support? I think some people are a little bit nervous, worried about saying the wrong thing. And I know this is something that the community says time and time again. And I do agree that it's up to everyone else to educate themselves. But I think that it's nicer when we're working together. So if your closing remarks on those in the faith community who want to be more inclusive of their LGBTQ plus brothers and sisters and members.
Yeah, I think we're at a point now that getting involved is one of the best things. And if they want to get involved with GLAAD, I would encourage people to be a part of the GLAAD Media Institute. I'm glad you're going to post that video. There's a good series of them. I'm one of the videos. And that can give people some really easy skills. because we have shifted most of our courses and trainings online, if people want to take an upcoming course, I have made those free and accessible for the public, which I'm really excited about. And people can use them and apply them within their own space. GLAAD also has ongoing campaigns and actions constantly, and always looking for people that want to sign on, follow us on social media. And then for the naming project, do feel free to look in on those virtual campfires, see what we're looking and sharing on social media, because that's the way we communicate with folks when we're not in camp space. And think about whether the naming project can be a good resource for a young person in their life who maybe is figuring out their sexual orientation, their gender identity, and their faith all at the same time. And then I've got a million other projects. I'm writing a book. I'm contributing to a spiritual reflection app. Lots of things. There's a podcast called Yes, Jesus that I'm helping to produce. So there's tons of stuff out there. If people want to follow, find the right thing for you, and we'll keep that menu ever expanding.
Fantastic. Ross, thank you so much. I'm going to, as I say, post different links. The naming project is one that I feel really excited about. And I just know that this conversation is going to make a lot of people happy, just give them that boost. That's what I'm seeking to do. I want people to hear from so many different people and think, oh my God, that's me up there. You know, I am legitimate. This is okay. And, you know, if you think about something like New Thought, traditionally, it's been middle-aged white men, you know, who are educated, who are of certain social class. So when people see me doing the work that I'm doing, they're thinking, oh my God, I can do it too. And so it's important that we hear from all aspects or all different types of members of our wonderful faith and spiritual communities. Ross Murray, the director of the GLAAD Media Institute, I cannot thank you enough for speaking to me today.
Lovely, thank you.